Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Tom Wright. Tom's current tenure, or RPA, began in 2001 and is now serves as the organization's president and CEO. RPA is the nation's oldest independent metropolitan research and planning advocacy organization. Its focus is on improving prosperity, infrastructure, sustainability, health, and quality of life in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut metropolitan region. In 2017, RPA released the fourth regional plan, which includes a host of recommendations on how to modernize transportation, address climate change, provide livable communities, and improve public institutions. Tom is here today to talk about the fourth regional plan and New Jersey's role in the larger metropolitan region. Please welcome Mr. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, and friends, Jeremy, others, friends here from many times. I'm looking out at the office I worked in for several years in the 90s at 744 Broad. It's a pleasure to be back to the NJTPA board. It's been almost 2 years since I came to provide an update on the work we were doing on the fourth regional plan. So I wanted to come this morning and have a chance to share some of the research that we've done, and in particular talk about the report that was just mentioned that we released 2 weeks ago on the state of crisis, the impending crisis of what would happen if Amtrak is forced to close the tunnels before we have new capacity. First, just as a little background for folks, I'm sure many of you remember, but RPA, we're coming up on our centennial. We've been around almost 100 years. We are a private, nonprofit research, planning, and advocacy organization that has been thinking about the long-term growth and prosperity of the entire tri-state metropolitan region. Parts of 3 different states, 31 counties, 782 towns and cities, over 23 million residents. I like to point out in particular that of those 782 towns and cities, one of them is New York City, and it's 8.6 million people, and 781 are not. And that often land use planning and investment decisions in our structure are made in isolation of others. And so part of what we try to do is partner with institutions like the NJTPA and county governments and others and other public authorities to provide some coherence behind these plans. In the last century, we produced 3 major landmark plans in the 20s, in the 60s, and in the 90s. Each one laid out very proactively major investments that we thought needed to be made to provide for the continued growth and prosperity of the region, the kinds of policies that we thought were necessary. They looked at, yes, transportation issues, but also community development, economic development, resilience, wetlands protection, a whole host of issues. And one of the things, of course, we do is look across the silos into all these issues and how they connect with each other. As was just said, in November of 2017, we released our landmark 4th regional plan after about 5 years of research and planning, outreach, engagement with the public, to talk about what kinds of investments and policies we were going to need going forward. The first thing we did was we put out a report, we called it our diagnosis, Fragile Success, which looked at what the trends and what had happened since the 3rd regional plan had been produced in the mid-90s. We recognized that we've made enormous strides in many ways. Our economy has largely been doing quite well. Many communities, in Newark, of course, among them, in Jersey City and others, have been really improving their quality of life in many ways. But then we identified real challenges. Opportunities are still limited for far too many people. There really is a crisis of affordability. In particular, we are very concerned about the cost of housing, and housing production has not recovered since the Great Recession. The economic relationship between city and suburbs has really changed. And now, 20 years ago, we used to talk about how it was important that the core of the region come along with the booming suburbs. But today, the suburbs are at threat of being left behind. We are, of course, much more vulnerable to natural disasters. In '96, I think we had a little footnote talking about how scientists said maybe the Earth was warming and we should be concerned about it. Now we know what's going on. And then, of course, we have to think of the government institutions, the major public authorities and others that are supposed to be driving this. And we're not sure that they're able to make the investments we're talking about. one of the key pieces of analysis we did was to figure out how much growth should we be planning for over a 25-year, period. We looked at the 1990 to 2015 time frame, a period that included two major recessions. The early 90s, which I'm old enough to remember, was actually a more severe recession, greater job loss, a slower recovery than even the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. But still, over that time period, we saw close to 2 million jobs and 3 million people come into the region for about 18 and 15% increases. If you look at projections today, NJTPA's, New York City Planning, NIMTIC, the federal governments, many of them project out over the next 25-year period, 2015 to 2040, for roughly half that growth. Only 850,000 new jobs and about 2 million new people. This isn't because people don't want to move here. It's not because businesses don't want to grow here. It's not based on the external demand for our goods and services and communities, but rather a feeling that we won't have the capacity, especially in the housing market and in infrastructure, to support that kind of growth. So after we looked at those projections, we did our own projections, what we call the potential. We worked with Moody'sEconomy.com and other economic consultants on this, and we said, if we released the restrictions we see on growth, what is the potential for growth over this period? And instead it was close to 2 million jobs and almost 4 million people. Now from our perspective, that becomes kind of the potential that we should plan for, because when we think about how are we going to invest in affordable housing, how are we going to create a cleaner, renewable source of energy, how are we going to invest in our infrastructure, all of that is really based on, those investments are going to be based on future growth. And in a low growth future, it's going to be very hard for us to identify the resources to make the kinds of investments that we need. So this becomes the kind of goal that we're reaching for. Of course, it has to be inclusive, sustainable growth. It has to bring all people up, but we think that there's a real opportunity to do that. We put out a series of reports in 2016 and 2017, problem statements about specific issues, rising sea levels, increasing unaffordability, access to nature, to kind of highlight and identify a couple of these issues. And then we put out the major report, just kind of looking at some of these. One of the things that we really recognize now, planners are much more aware of the fact that public health is to a large degree, while we focus on access to health care and facilities, say, and benefits, in fact, fully 80% of an individual's health is going to be determined by the community that they live in. As the folks at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation put it, your zip code is a greater predictor of your overall quality of life than your DNA, your genetic code. And so understanding these relationships is something critical that we're bringing into the issue. We also, and I mentioned this about the suburbs falling behind, I grew up in North Jersey in the 1970s and the 1980s, essentially in a suburbanizing economy. From 1975 to 2005, for every 10 jobs created in the entire 31 county region, close to 9 of them were outside New York City. New York saw some transfer from blue to white collar, but it didn't add very many jobs. Instead, it was the Wealth Belt here in New Jersey, Fairfield County, Nassau County. That's where most of the job growth was going. For the last 10 to 15 years, not only did New York catch up, but now it has surpassed the rest of the region. And of course, we now see close to 90% of the jobs located within the 5 boroughs of New York. The fastest growing boroughs are actually Brooklyn and Queens. And even in the aftermath of the fiasco of Amazon in Long Island City, there's clearly an expectation that job growth is going to continue fairly rapidly there in New York City. Now, it doesn't really have the capacity for this, and what we want to see is make sure that that growth is evenly spread and that all communities, including, say, this one, benefit from it. We also, of course, look at travel patterns, and this is an interesting series of graphics that have been very influential for me. From 1990 to 2010, to the degree that there were new jobs added in New York City, they largely were being either populated by people who lived in the 5 boroughs or from New Jersey. Long Island saw literally no growth of daily commuters into New York over an entire generation. While New Jersey, what were we doing? We were investing in New Jersey Transit. We had a strong state plan in place where we were creating opportunities for more multifamily housing and redevelopment in towns near train stations. And it was kind of an experiment in transit-oriented development, and it worked. And it provided enormous prosperity because these folks would bring these jobs, which pay on average 60% more than jobs in New Jersey, and they would bring that wealth back to their communities every month. It would translate in property taxes and value added to communities. More recently, we've started to see some kind of leveling out of this, and while New Jersey has still continued, over 5 years, 50,000 new commuters, 10,000 a year, enormous growth. But Long Island has started to get into the game. Long Island, as you may know, is building East Side Access, which will provide a second route into Manhattan and the third track. And of course, we're starting to see growth in the Hudson Valley too. But as we project out over the next 25 years and the growth that we expect to see, we see the opportunity for New Jersey to increase its daily commuters by 150,000 into the central business district if we have capacity. We think about half of that, those folks would be going to Brooklyn and Queens, not to Manhattan, so we need better access there. But this will only happen if we have the capacity to do it. And if we don't, we do think that we'll see these kinds of jobs go to other parts of the region. So out of the fourth plan, we produced this plan and we kind of identified our 4 value sets: equity, health, prosperity, and sustainability. And we came up with 61 recommendations to try and address these issues and drive these things forward. I won't go through all of them, but let me just give you a kind of overview of the 4 categories. We talked about fixing the institutions that are failing us. We created 50 years ago an MTA, 100 years ago a Port Authority, but we don't have right now, we think, the institutions that are capable of driving the kinds of investments that we're going to need to deal with our climate and create the capacity for growth that we want. Rising to the challenge of climate change, understanding that our sea levels are rising, storms are becoming more frequent. We have to be protecting populations and figuring out how to deal with that future. Creating a dynamic, customer-oriented transportation system. This is about bringing technology into transportation, which has, of course, really changed more in the last 5 years than it probably did in the prior 50. And kind of harnessing and using technology, and then making the region affordable for everyone, everywhere. Just to give you a quick sense of what some of these things mean. We're looking at reforms of the major public authorities, and we think that there are opportunities to try and reinvigorate that public authority model and give them more resources. The biggest that we see, of course, is putting a price on driving. And from New Jersey, we're already paying a toll to cross the Hudson River. But from Long Island and Westchester and Connecticut, what we see is toll shopping. People are actually incentivized to drive out of their way to get free crossings into Manhattan. And in about 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks, the New York State budget has to be approved, and it will either include congestion pricing for the first time, which we estimate could generate between $1 billion and $1.5 billion a year for transit investments, or it will not. And we're spending a lot of time on that these days. We also talked about things like pricing carbon. We have here in New Jersey, we are part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and we're thrilled about that. Out on the West Coast, they are using pricing carbon in the transportation sector to invest in transit, and we think that those are kinds of strategies we should look at. And creating resiliency commissions. We did here in New Jersey in particular, I think we can be very proud of the Pine Barrens and the Highlands Council and work that we did with regional commissions to protect drinking water supply. The challenge for the next generation is going to be protecting coastal areas, and so we can take that same model and apply it to coastal areas to make sure we do smart planning so that we're not putting investments in population at risk. Let me talk about affordability a little bit. Housing production has not rebounded from the recession 10 years ago. We generate about 60,000 units a year right now. We think that that number needs to be closer to 90,000 units a year. If you want to see what happens when you have an increasing economy and job growth without housing production, just jump on a plane, go out to the Bay Area and take a look at what's happening in San Francisco. It's not a pretty picture. And so we want to see affordability increase. We think that we can do this largely, and of course New Jersey has many of the policies in place to incentivize this, but we can still do it largely through conversion. 2/3 of the population growth that we expect will be in the over 65 cohort. And so rather than building large lot houses, big houses on large farms and other things, what we're talking about are conversions, infill development, transit-oriented development. And in particular, we think that there's an opportunity with the train stations and the parking lots around this region to take these kinds of surface parking lots, and my car is right now down in West Windsor at one of these things. This is publicly owned land, it's flat, it's served by infrastructure. And more there's an opportunity now, and it doesn't generate really any property tax revenues, it really is just necessary as part of the transit system. But with the transportation network companies and the for-hire vehicles really exploding, we see an opportunity over the next generation to have more people getting to and from the trains by different modes, which would allow these sites to become redevelopment opportunities. This can provide capital funding for our transit authorities. It is a more environmentally sensitive use of the land. It provides more benefits for the communities, and we want to start working on some of those areas. In terms of climate change, I talked about resiliency commissions already. We know that local politicians don't necessarily want to go out and tell people that they have to pull back from where they live. That's more our job on the civic side, but we're going to identify places where we can see growth. We've also talked about in the region, when you look at sea level rise in two places that are going to be most impacted by it, and that's the Meadowlands and southeastern Queens. And so we want to see plans that proactively identify those challenges, and if dozens of communities are working in isolation from each other, each thing that they do to protect themselves will simply flood their neighbors. So we want to see them work more closely together. Another of the proposals we're very proud of, and I think the NJTPA has been working on really wonderfully too, is really connecting the trail network of the region. We identify kind of existing trails and which are the missing pieces, and say our friends at the Trust for Public Land and other nonprofits have been doing a wonderful job of picking up on this and finding opportunities to complete this network so that we have a trail network that truly serves the entire region. Finally, I'll get to the transportation section. Might be of interest here. So we talked about issues like modernizing the New York City subway system, building complete streets and adapting to new technologies and other things, and of course expanding Trans-Hudson capacity. One thing I want to highlight, and I do want to mention here, we also looked at the airports. About 9 years ago, we put out a report looking at the long-term growth of the region's airports. We are supportive of what's being done at Terminal A. I think the rebuild of LaGuardia is going to be terrific, and especially using a P3 model. I hope that that will be something that we'll see more of. And even the Kennedy expansion is truly impressive, and it will add to amenity at the region's airports. We're very concerned about capacity, and in particular, access to the airports and the capacity that they have. And we do believe we're very supportive of efforts to extend the PATH system out to Newark Airport. We are going to be looking at the LaGuardia Air Train extension and eventually talking about Kennedy connections too. Those are really critical. The issue that we worry about with the airports is that we're not talking about runway capacity. And at some point, to increase total capacity at our region's airports, we're going to need to be addressing that. So we looked out and said, what a generation from now, once these buildings have been fully amortized, depreciated, what would we be thinking about? And we talked about a Newark airport that essentially moves out towards the northeast corridor. This is similar in some ways to Atlanta's Hartsfield Airport, and has new runway capacity and truly expanded. This is about a 50% growth increment over current capacity at Newark Airport. We think that these kinds of investments, especially at Newark and Kennedy, are things that we ought to be thinking about now. In terms of the Northeast Corridor, we looked at the entire region, saw that 150,000 growth projection I talked about. Two things I'll say even before we put this report out. In crossing the Hudson, we identified some other priorities that we thought were going to be necessary. One of them, in terms of the bus terminal, and I know that the Port Authority is making plans for that, we've encouraged the Port Authority to consider 2 terminals instead of 1. And we think that a second terminal somewhere on the west side could be a potential quicker way to get capacity for buses into Manhattan, especially since we're concerned about the loss of capacity here. And a second is, as far as the Gateway project is concerned, we are enormous supporters of Gateway, of course, but we want to see it planned and designed so that eventually it can be built as a through-running operation, not terminating at 7th Avenue, but continuing with 2 new tunnels also under the East River out to Sunnyside, Queens. That would actually create more capacity under the Hudson River, the rest of the world, and in particular, I think in London, the Crossrail project is probably the greatest analog to this. They're not building terminals anymore because there's not as much capacity in a terminal operation as a through running one. I know that we have to get, you know, the Portal Bridge and other things going, and we have to get Gateway built. But one of the things we've said is we're going to need all of this capacity and more, and that's part of the concern we have. At the same time, we've been really concerned about what happens when we lose capacity. And I'll say that this study came from about 4 years ago at the Regional Assembly. Each spring we have a major convening of civic, public policy, transportation, real estate professionals in the region. About 4 years ago, I got up on stage and we had one of those polling technologies. And I asked the folks in the audience, there were about 1,000 people there, what did they think was going to happen first? That we were going to build the Gateway project, or that we were going to lose capacity under the Hudson River for a significant amount of time? 89% of the people there voted that we would lose capacity first. We happened to have Tony Kosha, who's a good friend, chairman of Amtrak, on the stage, and so I turned to Tony and said, what do you think about that? And Tony's response was, I'm wondering what that 11% are thinking. So that became for us a real concern, and we thought, we all know that it'll be devastating if we lose capacity under the Hudson River, but how devastating? Where? Who? How will it play out? So we decided to work with some consultants and partners and others to really generate this. And I want to thank NJ Transit and the Port Authority, the MTA, Amtrak, and other agencies, and the TPA, which helped us with this. And what we tried to do as best as we could was create a scenario that would say, in the circumstances that Amtrak needs to close the tunnels, close one at a time for 2 years each, so 4 years total, what would be under a planned closure, doing the best we can to try and still get people under the Hudson River, what do we think the effects would be? First off, as we've talked about with others, the capacity loss when you close one of the two tunnels is not just a 50% loss. Trains have to run in both directions, and so we estimated it would be closer to a 75% reduction in capacity. You can't just run them in all morning. There isn't room there at Penn Station for them. And so trains have to be going in both directions. With that 75% reduction in capacity, we estimated that the total cost over 4 years would be around $16 billion. Most of that, about 3/4 of that, is in lost productivity and wages. People who either take longer to get to work or can no longer get to work. And that has repercussions. And we can travel this, and I think as the chairman was saying, this is national. These are not North Jersey or just New Jersey and New York numbers, but you can actually measure these impacts all the way down to Virginia. The largest is, of course, in lost travel, but we estimated it would cost the economy over $1 billion over the 4 years just in goods movement. Air travel, because there is limited supply and those Amtrak trains are already about 90% filled, but people trying to travel between New York and Washington would now have to go on planes, and because of that hard cap, at the airports there's no more, the airlines can't just add flights, so what would they do? They would raise prices. And then even safety and public health, we could calculate impacts with this. Where this came from, just to break this down a little bit more for this audience, there are about 67,000 people during the peak hours traveling across the Hudson River. We estimated that in a planned shutdown scenario, and this would really be very hard, but we estimated that about 29,000 people could still take a train to their destination into New York on a daily basis, but that 38,000 people could not. We figured, we kind of looked at the modeling and calculated that about 13,000 people could cram their ways onto the PATH system. I ride the PATH on a regular basis myself, 13,000 people during the morning peak is not a very pretty idea. How those people would get to the trains either in Hoboken or Newark would be very hard, but that was kind of our estimate of what could potentially happen. And then about 5,000 on the bus and ferry. Again, how people would get to the PATH bus and ferry would be quite hard on the regional transportation network, but we estimated we could do that. That still left 11,000 people trying to drive in the morning, and about 4,000 people who would just not be able to make it. We calculated that for maybe a year, those folks could continue to work remotely or other things, but over 4 years, we don't think that that's actually feasible. So those were the estimates we made. I want to be clear that we considered this kind of a best case scenario. This is under a planned shutdown where PATH, bus, ferries all have an opportunity to ramp up, where NJ Transit is able to try and figure out how it can get the most capacity out of the most riders out of the capacity that it has. And so an unplanned shutdown or shutdown of both tunnels would of course be much more severe than this. The thing though, and I think folks here understand better than most, is that when you take 11,000 people and you dump them onto the road network, you are going to impact the daily commutes of about 250,000 people who drive. Half of them not even going to Manhattan, just trips within New Jersey, will suddenly be impacted. And we estimated that about 245,000 people would see their commutes increase by at least 10 minutes. 100,000 of them would spend more than an hour a day commuting each day, and there are another 170,000 people on the path and buses who would also be severely impacted. So it's the ripple effects across the economy where the big costs come. Overall, this adds up to more than 500,000 travelers, homeowners, and businesses, all of which will be impacted. The delays in freight that I talked about, travel between Washington and New York, our models estimate that the cost of flying between New York and Washington will go up between 65 and 110%. Essentially, it becomes about as cheap to fly to Washington as London, pushing out all leisure travel probably. State and local tax revenues would decline by $7 billion over this time period. $1.5 billion in federal taxes lost, and again, you can measure those impacts all the way down to Virginia. And then we talked about 9,000 additional accidents, increasing air pollution, and we think adding up to about 90 to 100 additional deaths over the 4-year period. Finally, and this is a really stunning statistic for me as much as I feel like I know the state, fully 40% of the residential property value in New Jersey is within 2 miles of an NJ Transit train station. 40% of all of the residential values in the state are dependent, are close to and connected to that connectivity that NJ Transit provides. We did a couple years ago a report looking at the increases in property values that were associated with Midtown Direct Service, the Secaucus Transfer, and the Montclair connection. And so essentially we ran that regression model in reverse and said, if we are going to see increased travel times from each of these areas, what does that add up to in terms of lost value of residential property? And the number is a staggering $22 billion. Of course, we all know how that would ripple into property taxes, causing devastating budgets at the local level, and really destroying equity here in northern New Jersey. To be clear, this is only on the residential side. There are over $200 billion worth of commercial properties at risk in Manhattan. We couldn't calculate what the loss of that would be, so we didn't even put it in here, but that would probably be additional. As a result of this, we've been putting out reports, and let me just add 2 other things on this. We didn't calculate the commercial property tax loss. In terms of time savings, we only calculated direct time lost. Of course, when people have more difficult and less predictable commutes, they have to add buffers in for their times. We didn't add that to the costs either. And then finally, of course, we were just estimating one of the tunnels coming out under a planned reduction in service. All 3 of those, whether it was an unplanned, more kind of emergency situation, losses in commercial value, or the additional buffers that people would add into travel times because of unpredictable travel, all of those would drive these costs up. That's why I would say that this is kind of a best case scenario, not a worst. Finally, we've been working with this Build Gateway Now coalition, buildgateway.org. I encourage everybody to go online, sign up, join. You'll get notices and other things about this. And this is part of what we're trying to do now with the results. We've been very impressed. Congressman Gottheimer and Congressman King have put together bipartisan legislation, essentially asking USDOT to kind of account for these costs and what they would do. Last week, Senator Majority Leader Chuck Schumer talked about a new way of trying to have the states build Gateway and essentially get reimbursed by the federal government later if we're going to see kind of opposition from the administration. I have to admit, I believe parts of the interstate highway system were essentially built by states in advance of the Eisenhower Act, and later they were reimbursed, so there's some precedent for that. But we've been very pleased by the responses to this. I'll finally just close with two things. One, on April 19th, we will have the RPA Assembly again at the Grand Hyatt in New York. We will talk more about these issues. I'd encourage you all to sign up, attend, join us, please. It's an opportunity to kind of show strength and talk about these issues. And finally, other things you can do: become a member of RPA, join. We have coalitions not just for Build Gateway, but Fix Our Transit, which is the group promoting the MTA and congestion pricing in New York, and Public for Penn, which is kind of looking at the whole set of Penn Station issues and how we can build capacity into the system. And with that, thank you very much for the opportunity to address this group.
Well, Tom, I'm sure there was some questions associated
Sure,
with
I'd
the
be happy.
presentation. First of all, I'd like to ask the board members, anybody who has a question, you'll get first dibs at it, then we'll go on to the public. Anyone with any questions? I'm amazed.
There's really no one on, I'll go.
Well, no, doesn't mean you want to go there. Maybe others who may join you along. All right, go right ahead.
So Tom, one of the kind of side notes that you mentioned when you were talking was that New York has $200 billion worth of commercial properties that could lose a substantial amount of their value when commuters can't get to them, and that New Jersey has about $20 billion of residential property that might have a similar problem. Do you think that, to the extent that municipalities derive the sweet part of their revenue from commercial properties, right, where the commercial properties pay a lot but don't use the services?
Yes.
And the residential properties pay a lot but use the services, that there's a bit of a bias in the way our regional transportation network is organized, in the sense that New York, Manhattan specifically, as the hub of the wheel, to which all of this massive investment devoted to delivering these passengers, right, gets the benefit in the form of massive commercial property tax revenues, while New Jersey, in a sense, subsidizes that via transportation investments designed to deliver New Jersey residents to New York, right? So what I would wonder is sort of two things. One is, do you have a thought in terms of making these capital reinvestments in these massive repairs as to how the cost should be allocated?
Sure.
In terms of how much should New York be paying for the benefit that it gets in terms of commercial property activity?
Yeah.
And how much should New Jersey be paying
Yeah.
for the non-benefit that it gets, right? First of all. And second of all, I wonder if the RPA has any less complicated ideas, less kind of cost staggering ideas in terms of how New Jersey residents can be delivered to commercial destinations within the state of New Jersey, such that there's greenhouse benefits, et cetera, to having a reduced commute, quality of life benefits, but also that the state of New Jersey can benefit from retaining its own tax base.
Sure. One thing I'll say first: the $22 billion is not the residential property at risk. It's actually the reduction in residential property values. The number of what's at risk is much higher. Look, there's a symbiotic relationship between New York and New Jersey, between New York and all of the suburbs surrounding it. It's one I would argue is beneficial for both sides of the river, of course, and all of those communities. The job growth has been largely in New York, probably more than it can handle right now. And so at RPA, part of our goal is to try and foster and create more job growth centers, more hubs outside New York City to try and attract job growth, so that we can see, and Newark, of course, is a leading example of this, but say Bridgeport, Connecticut, White Plains, New York, there are other communities, the Nassau Hub in Nassau County, there are other places where this can go too. We see that as also beneficial growth for both sides. But to be clear, say for Newark to generate more jobs here, I think the single greatest strategy to do that is to have excellent transit connections to New York City. because both you can see more, there's more capacity in the transportation network for jobs to go in the same direction, in both directions, I'm sorry. I mean, this was, for instance, why Amazon's choice to go to Long Island City made a lot of sense. More residential development in Queens, just pushing people onto packed subways in the morning doesn't make sense, but more job growth there means that you're using, the trains run in both directions, of course. And I think that, say, for a community like northern New Jersey, kind of building on its access to that expensive, high-yield place of New York City is the best strategy to try and grow jobs here in northern New Jersey. I don't think that kind of not having mobility connections there is ever going to be a selling point for industry trying to come here. And so that would be my large argument. And of course, the taxes due, New Jersey, you could argue, New Jersey subsidizes with its investments in NJ Transit. Of course, it also sees more than that money come back into its local coffers, again, because of those folks. I thought that the original deal, I should say, struck about 2.5 years ago, where the federal government would pay for half of Gateway and each New York and New Jersey would each pay for a quarter, was probably a very good deal and was an excellent structure for the states to be considering, and a kind of relationship between the federal government and the states. Whether or not you would shift it one way or the other might make sense, but I think as a kind of having the broad outline of a compromise, that really made a lot of sense. It's a complicated question you're asking, obviously.
Okay. I have one, Tom Freeholder. The plan for Gateway and the second Hudson River Tunnel is twofold. First of all, it's about being able to take the current tunnels out of service for repair, and it's second about creating redundancy as well as increased capacity in the long term. Are there any other redundancy investments that RPA advocates or that we ought to be making, such as extending a subway line, extending path, that ought to be going on in tandem with our advocacy?
We looked at all of those issues kind of across modes as part of the research on the 4th Regional Plan. Buses, ferries, path, subway extensions. In particular, we thought that, of course, ferries are the system that can be ramped up the most rapidly and would probably be needed in an emergency, but then you have to get to the ferries. They provide good service from the water's edge to the water's edge. On the path system, we've been enormously supportive of the Port Authority's investments in the system, in the signals, in allowing for longer cars. And one of the things that we think is kind of missing in the debate about extending the path out to Newark Airport is that by combining that with a new rail yard out there, you can actually get service improvements along the entire path network, which I think serve all of the communities. It provides access for folks living in the Dayton neighborhood to the jobs market. It provides more capacity in Jersey City for the kind of growth that's happening there, and of course in Lower Manhattan. The third, we really did look at, and I alluded to it briefly, but the bus system, we think that we're going to need capacity in the buses if and when we lose capacity under the Hudson River. And we understand that the Port Authority is kind of looking at and going to be going public fairly soon with more documents on this. I sense that there's been a lot of attention at doing an overbuild on the bus terminal. Before committing to that, we wanted to see whether a second bus terminal couldn't be built somewhere faster and cheaper, frankly, to provide for additional capacity in the situation that we might need this. And so we'd like to see that as part of the analysis that's put out there. But at the end of the day, nothing will replace New Jersey Transit Amtrak service to reach into the entire core of the region. I think, as was said at one of the maybe last month's meeting here, and we saw this years ago when we were looking at the ARC project, building a new tunnel not only doubles the capacity, but it essentially doubles the population in New Jersey that's within a 50-minute commute of Midtown Manhattan, which is kind of the greatest generator of prosperity that our species has ever invented. So it's really worthwhile doing because it reaches across the entire region. And so it provides more affordability, it provides more community development. And it's, when we were doing an earlier study about what happened with residential values, I said we'd run the number in reverse on the $22 billion. When we ran that model the first time, essentially it calculated that for every dollar that you spent digging a tunnel under the Hudson River, you were putting $1.50 in the pocket of a New Jersey homeowner. It's like the return on investment is that.
Okay, any other questions from the board members?
Jeremy? No other questions, except I apologize, except perhaps just a statement.
Sure.
Tunnel without question is critical. The expansion of the system, especially when New Jersey style, to improve and reach areas that are not currently being served, has to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You can't put a VNT tax in place. You cannot penalize people that do not have access at this point to any sort of mass transit. It has to be a regional plan. If it truly is a regional plan, it has to provide.
Jeremy, just a few notes, and Tom, thanks very much for the presentation. And I guess going backwards in sort of what you're talking about, our view at NJT is and we've said this for over a decade, really there needs to be two major capital investments in transits and mobility. So on the rail side and the bus side, those markets are not entirely interchangeable or even in large measure interchangeable because of where they go, to your point, Freeholder. So we've always advocated for the rail capacity expansion as well as a bus capacity expansion. And we've obviously done a bit of work on both of those over the years. I would also, I can't help but note, the dollar figures you're talking about in terms of the sort of spin-off effects and the benefits of transit. And, I just suggest to everyone at the table and in the audience, when you're talking about, what NJT actually gets out of from a budget process, and when we start sort of nickel and diming, frankly, when we're looking at that kind of magnitude of benefit, maybe the nickel and diming shouldn't quite happen in the way it does. So that's a little shameless plug for my organization, but we do not see any of the benefits, any of those economic benefits that are
Right,
discussed.
they don't come back into the NJ Transit budget or the capital budget. And that lack of a feedback mechanism is what means these investments that would generate enormous prosperity, somehow we don't have the money to do it.
Correct. And then the third and final thing is we actually are very much on the same page in terms of the sort of second phase of Gateway, or the transit and rail capacity expansion, which is the first job in the existing Port Orange Bridge project. The Hudson Tunnel project is just to maintain what we have. But after that, how do we expand capacity in a way that is cost effective and flexible and does provide for future growth? And we do believe there are some tweaks that should be made to all the concept planning that's gone on today. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks. NJ Transit's been a terrific partner for us in this work.
Okay, I will open it to anybody in the audience who may like to ask a question. We have a limited number, but we'll take as we can. Sir, you'll have a mic coming to you.
Good morning, Tom. Thank you for a great presentation. Magda Haggad from Michael Baker. I also cannot help it but to notice the extreme change in the suburb when you're going forward. There would be 87% growth in urban areas versus the 13% growth in the suburbs. I mean, what does your organization recommend to balance that equation? Because obviously 87% growth in the urban area puts more and more kind of load and stress on the housing affordability. Thank you.
I should have stressed that 87% is not our projection going forward, it's what's been happening in the more recent past. We don't think that's sustainable or good for the region. You can't have all of the growth happening there in the core. And so what we're talking about are investments and policies to protect coastal areas, to invest in our transportation capacity, to build more affordable housing, multifamily housing, so that we can have a more balanced growth projection going forward. We did kind of look at scenarios. How much growth can you get in Hudson County? How much? But we didn't kind of put those out as recommendations because it's hard to get to that granular a level. And these major decisions are kind of impact on it. There's a kind of binary, either we will have capacity under the Hudson River or we will not. There are other issues outside New Jersey that will have a big impact on this. If the subway system continues to fail and we are seeing subway ridership decline in New York, then job growth will decline dramatically. Right now, city planning's projections for population growth in New York, Plan YC came out about 10 years ago, And it was supposed to be a long range, a 30-year plan to allow for 1 million more New Yorkers. In 10 years, they've gotten 2/3 of the way there. 600,000 people have moved into New York. At city planning, they essentially say New York will get to 9 million and then just stop growing. Because people will be priced out, pushed out, whatever. That's not, we would rather see there being capacity for growth in places, again, I'll say Jersey City, Newark, Hudson County, Bergen County, Passaic, Patterson, all these communities that would benefit enormously from these kinds of investments. Because if it's not balanced growth, then what it's going to do is put more pressure on communities. And the backlash in Queens against Amazon, I think, was kind of textbook 101. What happens if people think that this growth is happening and they're not going to benefit from it and they don't see the capacity for it. And so that's not a situation that we want to see replicated.
Anyone else from the audience have any questions?
Hi there. Mike Liscatos from Passaic County. What role do you see some of the emerging technologies having more on the tail end of the growth period on mixing modes and looking at these transportation systems merely as capacity, regardless of how you get there, whether it's autonomous or something we haven't even thought of yet? How do you think that'll really impact?
Those are, and of course, autonomous vehicles and the uptake in them is probably the greatest unknown that we couldn't pick any one scenario and plan for it because the delta is so enormous between what might happen in uptake or not. You know, we're very bullish on these technologies and the opportunities that they provide to move people more efficiently and effectively around the region. And in particular, what you're starting to see, of course, is these companies Lyft buying Motivate, the bike share company, because more and more of their trips are beginning or ending with a bike trip as part of it. The growth in scooters and other things. The growth of carpooling, and I'm old enough to remember when the Clean Air Act amendments required the employee trip reduction program, which was a spectacular failure and wildly inefficient way of trying to get people to carpool. But now, of course, you're starting to see with Uber Pool and other opportunities, probably this stuff really potentially starting to take off. And I think suburban mobility in particular has the greatest opportunity to see probably the greatest efficiency gains and mobility gains. So we're hoping that these things will work together. Of course, the new technology, if anything, it requires the public sector to be more thoughtful about creating policies to help kind of channel and guard. There've got to be some guardrails on this. Sharing data becomes enormously important to make sure that the public sector knows what's happening out there on its streets and roads and highways, and so it's able to kind of use it. I do think that pricing is going to be a policy, especially with declining gas tax revenues. We're going to have to think about pricing both as a revenue source and as a way of managing transportation capacity, because we all know that when it's a free-for-all, what you have is the system it's the crisis of the commons. The system, everybody tries to use it, and then the whole thing crashes. But overall, I think we're very optimistic. We've been paying a lot of attention to Summit, New Jersey, and the experiment that happened there with, instead of building a parking garage, trying to see whether some kind of ride-sharing strategy could be superior. I think that eventually we're going to start to see the uptake of these things more rapidly, and it's going to provide much more mobility and access than people currently experience. And so we're very excited about that. But when, how fast, who, I couldn't tell you, and I think we're all in for a wild ride.
Anyone else? I don't see any other hands, so.
I have one question. Hi, Tom. Barker Patel from Jersey City. You mentioned about 80% of the community's health depends on location-based conditions, and we've certainly done a lot of work in Jersey City to have dense, walkable neighborhoods and things like that. I think in the last long-range plan put out by the TPA, there was mention about just the amount of growth that's happening in the downtown areas in Jersey City, and how just with full build conditions in 2 of our redevelopment areas, PATH would be at or beyond capacity just from those areas, not even looking at Journal Square. And recently we've noticed some trends in how people are getting around and access to vehicles, and we've noticed that the number of households in Jersey City that own that have no access to vehicles or don't own vehicles at all has increased, which we like to see. The number of households with one vehicle or two vehicles has been about stagnant, and then the number of households with 3 or more vehicles has increased by about 10% since the last APS.
Wow.
We attribute a lot of that to things like Lyft and Uber, and not having any regulations in place for having rideshare companies, but having them be like shuttle vehicles or higher occupancy, as opposed to Lyft or Uber rides, which is one passenger. And I think the confluence of all of those things, people not being able to get on the path, people finding it easier to take those rideshare services, is all playing into something that we'd like to get control of, because we are on the way to a lot of the commuters making their way into Manhattan. I'm wondering if you have any insight. You mentioned you've looked at Hudson County specifically, but haven't published anything. I wonder if you have any insight on that in the regional context.
Yeah, that's trying to unpack that.
Yeah.
First off, I should have mentioned one of the things I didn't. You're talking about the households. It reminded me of the 11,000 additional drivers that we estimated. Half of those households would have to purchase a new vehicle just to do that, which is not the kind of trend we want to go. Also, we've looked at modeling of potential future uses of the ride-sharing industry. And essentially, if what you're talking about is an industry where it's one person in the back of the car being driven by one other person, we're all in for a lot of trouble, because the system breaks down very quickly. I'm measuring the impacts of 11,000 additional daily drivers and the implications they have on 250,000 people. If we started to see, of course, in New York City, we estimate something like 50,000 additional Uber and Lyft drivers on the roads today, and if you haven't been lately, it's just terrible, and everybody can see it in the traffic congestion. So we have to try to incentivize more people in the back of the car. One influential piece I saw by a friend, Bruce Schaller, argued that essentially the magic number was 2.5. If instead of one person in the back of a vehicle, you had 2.5 people in the back of a vehicle, 2 or 3 on average, you then see a system that works very, very well, and one that has reduced congestion, improved travel times, and other things. So policy needs to move in a direction, and this is land use policy, this is tax policy, this is regulatory policy. All of it ought to be moving in a direction to try and encourage and incentivize those types of trips, because they're much more efficient for the network. And of course, there's these companies which really see themselves as information technology companies that happen to have for rubber tire vehicle that's providing the service. And we do expect, when autonomous vehicles come, that these will probably be early adopters after all. So we need to try and move policy to make sure that as these industries emerge and grow, that they're providing more of this pooling ride, and we should provide financial incentives, regulatory incentives, and everything to try and encourage them to do that, because we think that that will be a much brighter future.
Anyone else? Thank you, Tom.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk. I appreciate it.